I live in Florida, and honestly, I don't know exactly where to begin. I tend to overthink and get lost in too many details when I explain things, so I'll try to stick to the basics, though I can already tell that's going to be hard. Our story isn't a simple one, not by any stretch, and I think part of me still hasn't wrapped my head around everything that's happened over the years. But here goes. My wife and I have been married for almost 18 years. It's crazy to say that out loud, 18 years. In December, it'll officially hit that mark, and it blows my mind. We've been through a lot in those years, but we've also built a family. We have two amazing kids, ages 5 and 7, and they're the center of our world. Parenting, especially with young kids, is chaos. Like beautiful chaos, but still chaos. Most days, I'm running around trying to balance work, school drop-offs, playdates, and all the endless tasks that come with having kids. But even when I'm exhausted, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Being a dad has been the most grounding thing in my life. But our relationship? Well, let's just say things haven't exactly been easy for a long time. Looking back, it's hard to pinpoint the exact moment things shifted, but I guess the cracks started forming earlier than either of us cared to admit. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up a bit. We got married in 2006. We were so young then. I was 24 and she was 23. Just a couple of kids, really, who thought they had the world figured out. When you're that age, everything seems so straightforward. You meet someone, you fall in love, and you think that's it, happily ever after. I guess in a lot of ways we were both still figuring out who we were. I mean, we'd only just graduated college 2 years earlier. We were supposed to be starting our lives, building our careers, and figuring out what adulthood actually meant. Except, life doesn't always go according to plan, does it? 2008 hit, and with it came the financial crisis. I'll never forget how that felt. One day you're hopeful, sending out resumes, thinking you'll land something solid and start building your future. And then, the next day, the economy collapses and everything feels uncertain. We were trying to make ends meet in a job market that was a complete disaster. I'd landed a pretty good job for about a year after we got married, middle management at a small tech company. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills, and I figured it was just a stepping stone to something better. But by 2009, I was laid off, along with half the company, and that's when things started to get rough. For the next few years, I was scraping by with whatever I could find, odd jobs, freelance gigs, anything that could bring in money. I worked in retail for a while, did some IT support on the side, even dabbled in web development when I could find small projects. It wasn't enough to feel stable, though. There was this constant feeling of dread, like I was treading water, barely keeping my head above it. And I know that weighed on my wife too, even if she didn't say it outright. She wasn't working at the time either. It wasn't for lack of trying. She'd graduated with a degree in graphic design, but like I said, the job market was awful. She spent years applying for jobs, going to interviews, getting her hopes up, only to be let down again and again. It was hard on her. I could see how much it affected her self-esteem. She's incredibly talented, always has been, but it felt like there was no place for her in the workforce at that time. So, for the first 6 or 7 years of our marriage, it was just me trying to bring in whatever I could. And I'm not going to lie, it was tough. There were moments when it felt like we were barely holding on. But in 2012, things finally started to turn around. She landed her first real job as a graphic designer. It wasn't exactly her dream job either, but it was something. And I could see the relief in her, that feeling of finally contributing, finally doing what she'd worked so hard to study for. She was proud and I was proud of her. But the job itself, it wasn't great. The company she worked for was small, and from what she told me, the work environment was toxic. They overworked her, underpaid her, and she came home drained every day. Still, it was a job, and at that point, that was a victory in itself. Meanwhile, in 2013, I finally found a stable position in IT. It was like everything was starting to fall into place. After years of uncertainty, we both had jobs, and for the first time in what felt like forever, we weren't constantly stressing about money. Things started to feel normal again. Or at least normal enough. We weren't exactly rolling in cash, but we could pay the bills, save a little, and start thinking about the future. We even started talking about starting a family. That was something we'd always wanted, but with all the financial instability, it just wasn't an option before. But now things felt possible. In 2017, our first child was born. It was one of the best days of my life. I know it sounds cliché, but it's true. Holding my daughter for the first time was this indescribable mix of joy, fear, and responsibility. It was like everything in my life shifted in that moment. My wife and I both knew that things would never be the same, and we were okay with that. We were ready to take on the challenge of parenthood together. Around that time, my wife was still working at her design job, but after our daughter was born, she told them she could only continue working if they allowed her to work remotely. I didn't think they'd agree, Back then, remote work wasn't nearly as common as it is now, but surprisingly they did. She stayed with them for another year working from home, which was a huge help with a newborn in the house. But by the time our daughter turned 1, she was done with that job. She hated it. She hated the company, hated the work, hated everything about it. I could tell it was taking a toll on her mentally, so when she decided to quit, I fully supported her. At that point, my job was going well enough that we could afford to live off my income for a while. It wasn't easy, but we made it work. In 2019, we had our second child, a little boy this time, and our family felt complete. 2 kids, a stable job, and a home we were slowly paying off. It felt like we were finally in a good place. After quitting her job, my wife had this idea that she wanted to go freelance. She'd always been independent and creative, so starting her own business seemed like a natural next step. She formed an LLC, picked up a few design projects here and there, and for a while it seemed like she was really enjoying it. But running a business is hard. It's not just about doing the work you love, it's about managing clients, dealing with taxes, marketing yourself, keeping up with invoices, all the behind-the-scenes stuff that you don't really think about until you're in the thick of it. After a year or so, she realized that it wasn't what she wanted. We didn't need the extra money from her freelance work, and the stress just wasn't worth it. So, she dissolved the LLC and decided to focus on being a full-time mom for a while. And for a while things were good. Or at least they seemed good on the surface. We were in a routine, raising the kids, working, managing life as best we could. But looking back, I think we were both ignoring a lot of the underlying issues that were starting to bubble up between us. We had this unspoken agreement to just keep going, to keep things moving forward for the sake of the kids, the house, our stability. We had invested so much time and effort into building this life together that it was easy to ignore the cracks. Then, about a year ago in late 2023, everything changed. My wife sat me down one night after the kids had gone to bed. I could tell something was on her mind. She'd been distant for a while, quieter than usual, lost in her thoughts. But I never expected what she was about to say. "I think I'm gay," she said. At first, I didn't know how to react. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. We'd been together for nearly 2 decades. We had kids. We had a life. And now she was telling me that she was gay? It didn't make sense. Or at least it didn't at the time. I mean, she'd never mentioned anything like this before. But the more we talked, the more I started to understand. She explained that this was something she had been wrestling with internally for years, even before we got married, but she never allowed herself to confront it fully. Several months went by after my wife's revelation about her sexuality, and honestly, I was still trying to process everything. Life had become this strange mix of surreal and normal at the same time. On the outside, not much had changed. We still had our regular routines, taking care of the kids, going to work, maintaining the house. But underneath it all, I was constantly grappling with the new reality. I guess I was doing my best to keep things together for the sake of our family, but there was this underlying tension that never went away. Then there was the girlfriend situation. My wife's girlfriend lived about 2.5 hours away. At first, it seemed like they were keeping their relationship at a distance, and I thought maybe that would be manageable. I didn't love the idea, but we had agreed to try the whole E&M thing, and this was part of it. I didn't want to be the one to pull the plug on something that my wife clearly needed to explore, even if it made me uncomfortable at times. But then things started to change. Apparently, her girlfriend's home situation wasn't great. I didn't know the full details, but from what my wife told me, her girlfriend was struggling, financially, emotionally, you name it. And that's when my wife started talking about ways to help her out. It started with little things. She'd talk about visiting her more often, maybe helping her cover some bills or expenses here and there. But then it escalated. My wife became fixated on this RV she found on Facebook Marketplace. It was being sold for $14,000, and suddenly she was talking about how we could buy it for her girlfriend. At first, I didn't think she was serious. I mean, $14,000 is a lot of money for us to drop on something like that, especially with everything else going on. But the more she talked about it, the more I realized she was serious. She was looking into how we could make it happen, figuring out if we could take out a loan or dip into our savings. She was even considering a home equity loan to use as a down payment to buy her girlfriend a house. That's when I started to get really worried. I was terrified she was going to do something rash, something that would put us in a financial hole we couldn't get out of. We'd worked so hard to build some level of stability, and the idea that she might blow it all on an RV or a down payment for someone else, it just didn't sit right with me. I kept thinking about our kids, about the life we had built together. We couldn't just throw all that away on a whim, could we? Then came the suggestion that really threw me for a loop. My wife suggested her girlfriend move in with us. At first, I was completely against it. The thought of having her girlfriend living under our roof with our kids, while we were still trying to figure out what our own relationship even was, it felt like too much. But my wife was persistent. She kept saying that it was just temporary, that her girlfriend needed a place to stay while she figured out her next steps, maybe found a job locally, and then they'd figure out what to do from there. Part of me wanted to say no. Hell, every logical part of me was screaming no. But then there was this other part of me that just didn't want to fight anymore. I was tired. I'd been fighting internally for months, fighting with myself, fighting to hold on to some sense of normalcy. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. I told myself that it would only be temporary, that maybe this would help my wife feel more settled, and things could calm down. That was around the first week of July. Her girlfriend moved in and things were strange to say the least. I didn't know how to act around her. I tried to be civil, of course. I mean, it wasn't like I hated her or anything. She wasn't the reason this was happening. But the dynamic was just so weird. It felt like there was this giant, unspoken tension hanging over everything. The kids didn't fully understand what was going on. They just thought we had a house guest for a while. And I guess that's what we told ourselves too. Around the end of July, my wife got a job. It wasn't anything fancy, just a minimum wage gig at a local retail store. She'd been offered another job around the same time, one that paid almost $25 an hour at a company about 45 minutes away, but she turned it down. I asked her why, because let's be real, we could have used the extra money, but she said she didn't want to work for a soulless corporate job. I didn't push her on it, but inside I was frustrated. We had bills to pay, a mortgage to think about, and now another person living with us who wasn't contributing financially. And speaking of her girlfriend, she didn't have a job. She was looking, I guess, but nothing had come through yet. So, for a while, it felt like everything was falling on me. I was still the one holding it all together, financially at least. And that weight, it was getting heavier every day. I tried to tell myself that we could still make this work. I mean, we had been together for 18 years. You don't just throw that away, right? I kept thinking that maybe once her girlfriend found a job and got her own place, things would go back to normal. Or at least, a new version of normal that we could all live with. But deep down, I think I knew that wasn't going to happen. The truth is, the only reason I haven't asked for a divorce yet is because I'm terrified of what it would do to us financially. I've run the numbers 1,000 times in my head, and every scenario feels like a disaster. Divorce would be a financial nightmare, there's no other way to put it. And with 2 young kids, the cost of childcare alone would destroy me. I keep telling myself that maybe I'm just being dramatic, but the reality is I feel like I'd be completely screwed in a divorce. We've lived in this house for 8 years, and up until recently, we've been living on my income alone. We've got a great interest rate on the mortgage, 2.6%. But if I had to refinance at today's rates, I'd be looking at a mortgage payment that's at least $160 more per month. And that's assuming I could even afford to keep the house in the first place. See, I know she's entitled to half the equity in the house. She's mentioned it a few times, mostly in passing, about how she could use her share of the equity to buy a place with her girlfriend. I get it, it's fair legally speaking. But that doesn't mean it doesn't scare the hell out of me. If we go through with a divorce and she takes half the equity, how am I supposed to pay her off? I don't have that kind of money just lying around, and there's no way I'd be able to afford alimony or anything like that. And if I lose the house? I've looked at rental prices in our area. It's insane. Any apartment I could afford would cost more than my current mortgage and give me a fraction of the space. Where would I even put the kids? How do I give them the life they deserve if I'm living in some cramped apartment that costs more than what we're paying now? It feels ridiculous that we're even in this situation. I mean, we've been living in this house on my income alone for years. We've made it work. But now, suddenly, everything is on the verge of falling apart, and I don't know how to stop it. So here I am, stuck in this weird limbo. I can't afford to stay, but I can't afford to leave either. And every day it feels like the walls are closing in just a little bit more. She says she doesn't want a divorce. She keeps telling me that. In her ideal world, we'd stay together, living under the same roof, co-parenting as best friends, as she likes to put it. I think the word best friends makes her feel better about what's happening, as if slapping that label on it somehow makes everything less painful, less complicated. But honestly, it feels delusional to me. She talks about us co-parenting like we're roommates who happen to have kids together, while she's fully invested in her relationship with her girlfriend. I don't know how to wrap my head around it anymore. If I'm being honest, I'm terrified to ask for a divorce, even though that's what I want. It feels like pulling that trigger will make everything spiral out of control and fast. I've heard enough horror stories from friends who've been through divorces, and it never seems to end well for the person who initiates it. I keep thinking about my friend who went through something similar a couple of years ago. He wasn't happy in his marriage, so he asked for a divorce, and the courts didn't seem to care that he had valid reasons. They just saw him as the one who broke up the family, and that's what I'm afraid of. The court's looking at me like I'm the bad guy. There's no abuse, no domestic violence, no affair on my part, no big blowout fights. We still get along pretty well, considering everything. We're civil, polite even. But it feels like there's this unspoken understanding between us that what we have is over. I know that. She knows that. Yet, here we are, still living together, pretending like we can just transition into being best friends while she carries on with her girlfriend. I don't want to be the guy who's viewed as breaking apart the family unit. Even though it feels like she's the one who left me. She might not have physically packed her bags and walked out the door, but emotionally, mentally, she's gone. And I don't know how to reconcile that in my head. If I file for divorce, does that mean I'm the bad guy for wanting to move on? For wanting some closure, some finality, when she's the one who shifted the whole dynamic in the first place? Before all of this, we had a good relationship. I can't stress that enough. I think about it all the time. We rarely fought, and when we did, we always found a way to work through things. We made decisions together, raised our kids as a team, and honestly, we were happy. Or at least I thought we were. We'd take the kids to the park, plan trips together, have movie nights on the couch after they went to bed. We had a good life. And we had a decent sex life too. It wasn't like we were in some dead marriage before all of this started. That's what makes this all so much harder to swallow. We weren't just coasting on autopilot before she realized she was gay. We were a real couple, partners, friends, and lovers. And now I feel like I'm stuck in this weird purgatory where she's married in name only, and I'm just expected to go along with it. To make matters worse, our youngest has developed this terrible separation anxiety. It's like overnight, she's become terrified that one of us will leave her. She'll cling to me or my wife, crying when we try to leave the house or drop her off at school. It didn't used to be like this. She was a happy, carefree kid. But ever since my wife started visiting her girlfriend in Georgia every other week, sometimes for 3 days, sometimes for 5, our youngest she can't handle it. I can see the confusion and fear in her little eyes every time my wife walks out the door with her bags packed. I'm so sick of this. I'm sick of the confusion, the tension, the uncertainty. I keep having these fantasies where I just kick both of them out, my wife and her girlfriend, and give my wife a huge chunk of our savings, like 75%, just to make it all go away. Just to not have to deal with this anymore. I imagine myself walking away from all of it, starting fresh, and only dealing with my wife when it comes to parenting stuff. But life isn't that simple, is it? I know there's no easy way out of this. I can't just snap my fingers and make it all go away no matter how badly I want to. Every time I think about asking for a divorce, I'm overwhelmed by the financial reality of it. I'm not trying to sound like a martyr or anything, but if we get divorced, I'm going to be royally screwed. It's not just about the house, though that's a huge part of it. We've been living here on my income alone for the past 8 years. We've made it work because we got lucky with a 2.6% interest rate on the mortgage. If I have to refinance that at today's rates, I'm looking at a mortgage payment that's $160 more a month. And that's if I even get to keep the house. I know she's entitled to half the equity, and she's already mentioned a few times that she's thinking about using her share of it to buy a house with her girlfriend. I don't know how I'd even pay her that equity. I don't have that kind of money. And what about alimony? How the hell would I afford that on top of everything else? If I lose the house, I'll have to rent somewhere, and any apartment I could afford would cost more than our current mortgage. I've looked into it. I'd end up paying more for way less space, and that's assuming I can even find something in a good school district for the kids. I don't want them to suffer because we can't figure out our own mess. It's ridiculous. We've been living here on my income alone, but now, if we divorce, it's like the whole system collapses. I can't wrap my head around how that even works. I mean, yeah, she's technically entitled to half of everything, but that doesn't mean I have the means to give it to her. And yet, it feels like I'll be the one who loses the most no matter what I do. I'll be the one who's left with nothing but a pile of bills, a cramped apartment, and 2 confused kids wondering why everything changed. I think what frustrates me the most is that she knows this is hard on me. She's even said as much. She's acknowledged multiple times how much this sucks for me, how unfair it is, and yet, she doesn't change anything. She keeps visiting her girlfriend, keeps pretending like this is a normal situation, and I'm left holding the bag. And then there's the whole no-fault divorce thing. I get it. It's supposed to make things easier, less contentious. But in a situation like this, it just feels like none of what I'm going through will matter in the end. We live in a no-fault state, which means it doesn't matter that she's essentially the one who left me, emotionally speaking. The courts won't take that into account. They won't care that I've been the one keeping things together for the past few years. None of it will matter. I feel stuck. I know I probably need to talk to a lawyer, but I'm scared that doing that will escalate things too quickly. Once lawyers get involved, it feels like things get ugly fast. And the truth is, I'm not sure how I'd even afford a lawyer. I've looked into it briefly and the costs are insane. It's like the system is set up to make people like me feel powerless. So, here I am, venting to strangers on the internet because I don't know where else to turn. I don't know what the next step is or how to even start moving forward. I'm overwhelmed, I'm angry, and I'm scared of what's going to happen next. I don't have a question really. I just needed to get this off my chest. One more thing happened just in the last week that really pushed me to take some kind of action. It started when I was going through You Need a Budget to check our finances. I've been trying to stay on top of everything lately, especially with all the uncertainty between us, and I noticed something that didn't add up. The income numbers didn't look right, her paycheck wasn't showing up like it should have been. So, naturally, I asked her about it. I didn't think much of it at the time, just assumed there was some kind of mistake or delay. That's when she dropped a bombshell on me. She had opened a new checking account without telling me. Not only that, but she'd changed her direct deposit at work to go into this new account. It had been 3 weeks since she last got paid, and I only found out about it when I pressed her on why her paycheck wasn't showing up. Her explanation? She was tired of me bugging her about overspending. That's why she had gone behind my back and done this without mentioning it. I was furious, not only because of the sneaky way she'd handled it, but because this felt like a whole new level of betrayal. We were supposed to be partners, or at least we were supposed to co-parent and manage our shared life in a way that still respected each other. But it was clear to me in that moment that she had already mentally checked out of any sense of responsibility toward our shared life. She was doing her own thing, making her own decisions, and leaving me in the dark. So, that's when I decided to start separating our finances completely. I couldn't risk her doing something rash with our money, especially now that she had this other account and was keeping things from me. I wasn't going to let her overspend and drag us both into financial chaos. I immediately began documenting everything. I paid off all our credit cards, down to a balance of $0. Then I removed her from my cards and made sure to remove myself from hers as well. It felt like a necessary step, even though it was just another reminder of how broken things had become. Next, I created my own checking account and changed my direct deposit at work. No more joint finances, at least not in the way we used to operate. We still had one credit card in both our names plus the joint checking account, but those would be strictly for shared expenses related to the kids. I wanted everything else separate. It felt like the only way to protect myself from whatever she might do next. But today was the breaking point. I got home from taking our youngest to school, and she completely blew up at me. It wasn't just a simple argument, she was furious. And why? Because I had suggested she should be responsible for 50% of the shared expenses. I mean, it seemed like a fair solution to me. We're both living in the house. We both have bills. Why shouldn't we split the shared expenses evenly? But she immediately escalated things. She jumped straight to the idea that I was being unreasonable, and within minutes she was throwing out threats, forcing me to sell the house, making me pay child support, and demanding alimony. It felt like the conversation went from 0 to 100 in no time at all, and I was just standing there, blindsided. The whole thing made my stomach churn. I've tried so hard to keep things civil. I've tried to avoid a situation where everything blows up, but in that moment I realized that no matter what I do, this is going to get ugly. And yeah, I know I'm going to need a lawyer. I've been avoiding that step for so long because I didn't want to escalate things, but at this point I don't think I have a choice. She's already talking about selling the house and taking me for child support and alimony. If I don't protect myself now, I'm going to be left with nothing. Part of me still holds on to this ridiculous hope that we can resolve this without a lawyer. I don't know, maybe that's just me being naive. I've read enough to know that lawyers are expensive, really expensive. And if we both get lawyers, I have this sinking feeling that the outcome will be exactly what I've been trying to avoid. We'll end up selling the house, splitting the equity, and then giving nearly all of that money to lawyers. Feels so stupid. I'm not trying to fight for the kids. We both agree on 50-50 custody, and I don't think there will be any issues there. We're both good parents and I trust her with them. But the house is going to be the real sticking point. I feel like I should be able to keep it. I'm the one who's been paying the mortgage for years. I'm the one who's kept us financially stable. Why should I be punished for the choices she's made? But I also know how this will probably play out. This is a no-fault state, which means none of the emotional stuff matters. The fact that she essentially left me for someone else, the fact that she's been the one breaking us apart piece by piece. None of that will matter to the court. All that matters is the legal and financial division of assets. And in the end, it'll probably come down to selling the house and splitting the equity whether I want to or not. I'm overwhelmed. I don't even know where to start. I know the obvious answer is to talk to a lawyer, but that feels like such a big step. Like once I do that, there's no going back. It'll be the beginning of the end and everything will spiral out of control. But I also know I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending that things are going to get better on their own. So yeah, that's where I am right now. Just trying to figure out the next move, feeling like no matter what I do, I'm going to lose something. Whether it's the house, the money, or the family we built together, something's got to give. I guess I'm just waiting for the moment when I finally decide I can't take it anymore and pull the trigger on this whole thing. Maybe then I'll be able to move on. Maybe then I'll finally feel like I'm in control again. But for now, I'm just stuck.